Welcome to the Political Buzz. I'm Phil Arno. Let me start by saying I wanted to call this show Common Sense because in my world, that's where everything starts. I'm sure a lot of you out there have heard the question, so if your friends wanted to jump off a bridge, then you'd want to do the same thing too, right? Parents back in the day tried to make us, while we were growing, learn a certain amount of logic in life. Then we enter the world of adults. The logic is still there, you just have to look a little harder sometimes to find it. Take politics, for instance, something this show will be all about. I once had a conversation with the New York State Comptroller. That was decades ago, and the state legislators wanted to pass a 25-cent per gallon gasoline tax in order to pay for improving roads and bridges. They absolutely promised that if this tax hike passed, that money could only be spent on roads and bridges. Now, there's a certain logic to that, right? Except that the comptroller told me that their little secret was there was already a state fund set aside to repair roads and bridges. And it could only be used for that purpose. And it had billions of dollars in it already. More than they needed. Logic? Out the window, right? Well, no, not exactly. You just had to look for the logic from the right angle. You see, the governor at the time, who shall go unnamed, felt that if that existing fund was used, well, it would come off the balance sheet for the state. And guess what? He, and I guess the legislators, wouldn't be able to brag about how well they were doing with the budget. So sneaking in a perfectly logical tax for a purpose that everybody agreed was necessary, perfectly logical. Talk about wanting someone to jump off a bridge. Look, I believe that if you look hard enough, everything makes sense. People do things for a reason, always. It may not be a good reason, but it's always a choice. At the time, the one who is making that particular choice thinks it makes sense. Well, today on Political Buzz, I'm going to start with a subject that seems to defy logic. Why is socialism becoming so accepted in this country? Simple question, not a very simple answer though. With me, helping to find the right logic here, is Sabina Ramsey. Sabina was born and raised in Sweden. She's an entrepreneur, an advocate for women and minorities, and a former president of the National Association of Women's Business Owners. And she's the owner of Insight Communications. So welcome to the show, Sabina. It's a pleasure to have you here, and we're going to be talking about socialism. And you grew up in Sweden, so you were there in the 70s and 80s when they were experimenting with socialism. And tell me a little bit about the experience, what led up to them going into the direction of socialism, and how it worked, and what happened from there.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's certainly a privilege to be here and talk about this issue. And yes, it's correct. I grew up in Sweden during the 1970s and 80s, and I have experience with what happened during that time, and a matter of fact, the change that happened after.
Do you know why they went in that direction, and why they decided to be socialist?
That's a good question. I mean, Sweden has, during the 1950s, was one of the fourth wealthiest countries in the world. And with Olof Palme, even before, there was reforms to really, I mean, Sweden is a pretty egalitarian society, very consensus-based, and the philosophy was that if everyone got what they needed, the society could be stronger, so to speak. So there was, you know, a movement slowly to kind of care for the residents of Sweden, and a range of reforms were introduced, and eventually it led to, in the 1970s, 80s, they experimented a little bit with socialism. But I do want to emphasize that Sweden is a very strong market economy today, and the fact that people believe that it's socialistic is absolutely not correct.
Yeah, we have, as a matter of fact, I have a video clip of Bernie Sanders where he says that if you want to see a good example of socialism, just turn to the Scandinavian countries, Sweden being one of the exceptions, and Norway, and let's look at that clip.
Yeah.
When I talk about democratic socialism, I'm looking at countries like Denmark.
When American politicians wrongly called Scandinavia socialist, Denmark's prime minister came to America to refute them.
Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy.
In fact, Denmark today is more free market than America.
The image of the Scandinavian countries as socialist, now that's not accurate. You know, when the people here say that's an example of where socialism works, it's been tried there, and they kind of backed away from that now. Their market economy.
Yeah, a matter of fact is that, you know, for the last 3 decades, Sweden has really focused on microeconomics and support of small businesses and being a leader of entrepreneurship and innovation in the world. And we have a very low corporate tax, and businesses in Sweden are thriving. However, there is a back end to that we can talk a little bit about later, with the higher personal tax that is much, much higher. But, you know, again, the fact that people believe that Sweden is socialist is absolutely not correct. And in fact, I have seen the clip where Bernie Sanders talk about Sweden being a model for democratic socialism. It's concerning, because there's nothing that is democratic socialism.
Well, you know, democratic socialism, they put the word democratic in front of the word socialism.
Yes.
And that's supposed to make it different. It's supposed to make it more acceptable. And Venezuela is a great example of democratic socialism. You know, as the leader was elected, okay? I think it was Cesar Chavez. It was elected, and the first time he was elected, then he changed the constitution, and he became kind of undefeated from that point on. He could not. He kind of stacked the deck, so he couldn't be unelected. And now you have a democratic socialist that basically became a dictator. And there are many examples of that throughout, you know, the world. Once you put a socialist into power, it's very rare that you can get him out of power. I mean, it just doesn't happen that way. And look what happens to the economy once the socialism takes over. It kind of takes away socialist economies. Kind of, they dehumanize the human spirit, don't they? They take away the incentive to perform.
You know, yes. I mean, I want to touch upon a few different things there. Obviously, I have no experience with Venezuela. I do know, and I'm a big believer in, you know, obviously, you know, there's a great need out there, and we have to be compassionate towards groups and individuals that need help. And we should do everything in our power to help and give a hand to people, so to speak. But I also believe, through my own experience, that you know, sometimes, and I'm talking about my own experience in Sweden, is that if you're always handed things on a silver platter, eventually you will not start to value that, and you can become passive as an individual instead of kind of forge through hardships that I am a big believer in. I'm a big fan of Rollo May, and he basically really emphasized that human existence is not easy, and that you have to kind of persevere and find your own way, and that's kind of an ultimate gift. Of course, there are needs, or there are a need for social services, and it's important, but that doesn't mean that it's socialism. A matter of fact, I think that the so-called democratic socialists have almost hijacked the fact that they promote social services and are ready to fill the needs in the society, but that is basically wrong.
Well, in Sweden, when they experimented with socialism, what was the result economically? As it went forward, what made them change their minds? Did the country suffer economically?
Yeah, as I said earlier, Sweden was fourth richest country in the world, and they started, especially during the 1970s, they implemented one policy that experimented a little bit with socialism, where that basically the employees got more and more ownership of the company in which they worked. And it actually led to a catastrophe. Not only, this was a time where one of the biggest protests in Sweden was held, but financially, the country totally got, really into a economic downturn. And there was consensus between the right and the left that Sweden really needed to quickly and swiftly make a change. They realized the importance of market economy and microeconomics. And I think it was in the beginning of 1990s where the shift kind of happened towards a more sound economy. They realized, people say, people over profit, right? But that's not how things work. I mean, it's a great idea. Obviously, we all want that, but there is. You have to think about the economy, because where are you going to get the money from? And that's kind of my perspective as an entrepreneur.
Well, you have to take into account human nature, and everybody wants to achieve something. I mean, that's human nature. You want to succeed in taking care of yourself, taking care of your family. Given a choice, if somebody's going to give you something, human nature says, well, okay, I'll take it. And the more you take, the more somebody gives you, the less incentive you have to achieve success in other ways. I mean, it's one way or the other in most people's lives. I mean, you achieve a goal and grow, okay, in your own personal life and achieve success in taking care of yourself and taking care of your family. You do better economically. But if you continue to get things without work and without ambition, that goes against human nature, I think. That's part of the flaw.
Well, I can only talk about my own experience. When I basically we moved to the United States in, I believe, 2003. And before that, I have been, studying in Canada. I have been studying in the United States previously. And, I had also experienced the immigration to Sweden and reflected on it quite a lot. And so when I became an immigrant to the United States, I kind of I shaked my own hand, so to speak, or I made an agreement with myself that I would not be any type of burden on anybody, but actually I really wanted to, forge my path myself from my own efforts. And I think that is important. And I think that if I was to be handed things at that point, I had wonderful support, by the way. Obviously, you need support as a human being, right? Yep. So, but I think that because I wasn't automatically handed anything to make my life comfortable, I was able to overcome a lot. It became an internal drive to find out what I needed to do next. And yeah.
That's what, that's how things develop. I mean, especially if you have a sense of self-worth and you want to develop things on your own, it's less of a struggle if you're not being constantly bombarded with free stuff. All right, we're going to come back in just a minute. This goes quickly, but there's much more to discuss here. Socialism is being accepted here in this country, and there's a certain logic that we have to explore there. Anyway, we'll be right back. Interesting discussion. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Political Buzz. My guest, Sabina Ramsey, and we're talking about socialism. We're talking about whether you call it democratic socialism or socialist democrat or whatever you want to, however you want to phrase it. Socialism is the key word, and people here now in this country are becoming more and more accepted of the word socialism, and it's becoming something that, a generation ago was kind of, you wanted to stay away from being a socialist. Now, not so much. People say, yeah, socialist, a poll said 42% of Americans think socialism is acceptable. And I don't know, as I said in my intro, I think there's a logic to everything, and there's a reason for everything. This one, I'm not so sure. I understand that people think that socialism is acceptable. I'm just not sure why. I know that in theory, on paper, it's like everybody gets what they want, and it's a wonderful system.
Yeah.
In reality.
Phil, let me start by explaining there's a difference between democratic socialism and social democrats in Sweden. Always when you talk about socialism, it's an ideology where you're moving closer and closer for the government to own the means of production, which means basically the government takes over more and more of the financial control of businesses. Yes, that might sound extreme, but that is what the ideology of socialism means. It's and I think it doesn't matter if you say socialism or if you say democratic socialism. It aims for the same thing. And people today, they misunderstand this. And I will go into that a little bit more. I just want to describe the difference between democratic socialism and social democrats. So Sweden the last couple of decades, been led by the Social Democratic Party. The Social Democratic Party is a very powerful working class party in Sweden. What they experienced after we kind of dabbled a little bit in socialism during the 1970s and 80s, they realized, the Social Democratic Party in Sweden, the working class party, realized that this is not working at all. We are losing money at a rapid rate, and we need to change course. The parties agreed to change course for the betterment of the country.
And that was because of government ownership of a lot of the businesses?
Yes, there was more and more government ownership. So what they did is, they introduced a school voucher, for example, is one of the reforms that they performed early in the 1990s. And also, like the pharmacies were government owned. There was a lot of different entities in Sweden that went from being government owned to more free enterprise. So there was a shift in thinking, and that's why it's important to explain the difference.
Well, I'm assuming that in Sweden, just as in America, when the government gets involved with something, the efficiency of how it's run automatically goes down, because the government isn't out there to not waste anything. It's not there because it's not their money, and it's not, the people who work in government are not worried about, they're not worried about making a profit. They're not worried about saving a little bit of money here and a little bit of money here and doing it the most effective way possible. They're just basically there to achieve a goal that's been set, and if that goal has been achieved, then they've done their job. They don't have to think about it, and they don't have to be efficient at it. They just have to do what they've been told.
Well, I do think that the Swedish government as a whole is efficient. I don't want to go into that. I do see that, there are things that are more, I would say, in my perspective, organized.
Okay.
But at the same time, you have to remember that the Swedish population is paying, if you earn $70,000, you will pay a 60% tax.
Okay.
So it's a very high tax burden in Sweden, and that's something that they have been accepting, but at the same time, they are driving business.
It comes down a little bit to a balance then, what you just say. When you go more towards the socialized system, you're basically saying the government is controlling more of what you produce than you are. I mean, if you earn 100% and the government takes 60% of it, now the government is determining what you've worked for 60% of the time. They're basically controlling that, and you're going to be able to spend and control 40% of what you've worked for. And so you have to be able to trust that the government is wise enough to spend that 60% the way you want it to be spent. Basically, that's the decision.
I think that's correct. And in Sweden, there's a high trust in government, and at the same time, as there is efforts for entrepreneurship and innovation and things like that.
Okay. Well, I mean, there's you can look at countries throughout the world, and I'm not sure what percentage of socialist countries can have the same statement that they have a high trust in government.
But Phil, I want to interrupt you and say Sweden is not socialist.
Okay.
You know,
right.
I really, like, it's not,
Well,
and I think it's almost like a common consensus that we automatically think that Sweden is socialist. Absolutely not. Sweden is a very effective market economy. But because of the development the last 100 years, they have a different sort of system than in the United States. They have, you know, there's more of a consensus, conforming, you know, to the group, like a little bit of groupthink in, well, maybe that's not correct, but there is, and the beauty of America, and what I absolutely love about America, is the fact that you can forge your own way, and it is still true today. You can forge your own way. You have more decision. You can make more decision about your own money and how you want to allocate that money. So for me, you know, growing up in the system, I have myself done a journey, right? And I don't know if I can move back to Sweden now, because I would not be able to pay that much tax.
Right.
So,
it's difficult to
yes.
to kind of give up that kind of economic freedom, because when you can keep more of your earnings and determine which direction they go, that's hard to give up.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time now, but I want to thank you for being my guest on the show. This is a discussion that can go on for hours and hours and hours. There's so many elements to the current direction that the country is going, and how many people say that socialism is acceptable and how many people are horrified at the thought. It's a discussion that we're going to revisit in shows to come, especially in light of the fact that the mayor's race in Buffalo has an element there that we need to discuss. I'm hopefully going to have the candidates on. At least I'm going to try. So stay tuned, and in the future few weeks in the coming election season, I'm going to have more on this with the political buzz, as well as other races, the Erie County Sheriff's race and the Erie County Comptroller's race. Hopefully we'll cover a little bit of all of that and give you a little bit of information. This is our first show back for in a while, so thank you for watching Political Buzz, and thanks for watching WBBZ. As always, we appreciate it, and we'll see you next time on Political Buzz.